Let's go up the beautiful 101 up to the state of Oregon, the defending Big Ten champions. And let's talk about them a little bit. You know, there was a lot of talk last season. Well, I talked to Oregon people before the season. I talked to Oregon people in the middle of the season. I talked to Oregon people at the end of the season. And a lot of times at every single part of the season, said, yeah, this Oregon team, it's up there as one of the best of all time. 2010, 2012, 2014, 2024 is certainly in that discussion. And winning the Big Ten championship in year number one, yeah, that certainly puts a feather into the cap of this 2024 squad. But you might take one of the most talented Oregon teams in 2024, and now we look forward to 2025, and now we're asking the question, could this 2025 team be better than this 2024 team that was number one in the country for a lot of the second half of the season? Now, the first thing that I want to dive into as it pertains to maybe dissecting this topic and trying to formulate an answer to that question is the quarterback position. I think Dante Moore provides more, he provides more at quarterback than Dillon Gabriel. I think there was a safe approach maybe as it pertains to Dillon Gabriel. I don't think it's any secret that Dillon Gabriel's arm strength and ability to stretch the field with the deep ball really wasn't there. And I think Dillon Gabriel just did things to protect, and I think Will Stein calling this offense really did a lot to protect the football. I was recently listening to an episode of the Ducks Dish with the great Justin Hopkins and Max Torres that really illustrated this point, and I tend to agree certainly with this point as well. I don't know how much explosiveness, deep shots, playmaking opportunities down the field that there were with Dillon Gabriel. Now, I thought, being a Heisman finalist, it clearly did well. It clearly fit into his skill set, but Dante Moore has got a live arm and a half, folks. There's been a lot of people nationally, now that the season is over, they're starting to look forward to next season. And Dante Moore is starting to get a lot of attention, and rightfully so. I've said this before. I think Dante Moore has the highest ceiling of a Dan Lanning era quarterback. And yes, that includes Bo Nix. I think having somebody like Dante Moore gives Oregon another added dimension going down the field. They have an NFL type of arm. Now, I know Dillon Gabriel is certainly going to get his opportunity within the National Football League, but I think Dante Moore just maybe uncorks another part of what Oregon's offense certainly can be in 2025. Having Super Frosh, Decorian Moore is certainly going to be able to help that as well. There's going to be a ton of speed on the outside with sub 4.4 guys, Evan Stewart and Decorian Moore. So that combined with the live arm talent of Dante, I think is going to unleash something within Oregon's offense. And I'm not the only person. If you think I'm stupid, okay, I'm not the only person. There are other national people out there with larger followings than me that think this as well. But I think there is going to be something unleashed in Oregon's offense that we maybe haven't seen in the Dan Lanning era, certainly as well. Let's talk about the line change that is the secondary. I think that, and I'll maybe talk about this towards the end when I'm really finishing up my point as to whether I think the 2025 Ducks could be better than the 2024 Ducks. But secondary, you've got a complete line change. There's a lot of new personnel certainly in that room. But here's what I will say about the secondary. I think Dylan Thieneman transferring in from Purdue is as good of a player, let me correct myself, is as great of a player as Oregon has had in their secondary maybe in a very, very long time. Oregon continues to get better and have more size and more length and more athleticism in their secondary as the years continue to go by. So although it's a new secondary, will it be a better secondary? I'll say this, Yeah, I know they brought in transfers, Theron Johnson from Northwestern and the aforementioned Dylan Thieneman. But beyond that, it's going to be a little bit of a younger secondary. But one thing that Oregon has been able to do is they've been able to recruit as good as anybody when it comes to the secondary, when it comes to the defensive backs. I would watch out for Ife Obadedegwu, Theron Johnson, as I mentioned before, Peyton Woodyard as a couple of names to keep an eye on. These are high-level guys. These are high 4-star players. In some instances, these are 5-star type of players. Like they've got 2 5-stars coming in as true freshmen in Naeem Offord and Trey McNutt as well. This, I think, the secondary is going to be a big pivot point. They had experienced players in the secondary last year in Jabbar Muhammad, Kobe Savage, Brandon Johnson, some of these guys that transferred over. But I think these younger players, and you've heard some of the older players in this room say this, but I think these younger players have higher ceilings than some of those transfers that have brought over. Will we see the higher ceiling in 2025? That's certainly the $64,000 question. Another part to the defense, the defensive line. There are people in duck circles right now that are looking all over this roster, that are looking at all of these rooms within this defense and saying, this defensive line group, it might be the best room on the team. It might be the deepest room on the team. Now, how can you say an Oregon defensive line might be deeper and maybe even better when you lose Jordan Birch, when you lose Jamari Caldwell, when you lose Derek Harmon up front on the defensive line? There are 2 big pieces returning that I think could be all conference players, and I think that's a big part. And this is what elite programs do. They lose players to the National Football League, and what do? They replace them with the 4-star guys, with the 5-star guys, with the really good talent. That's what great programs do year after year after year, and that's what we're starting to see with Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks certainly right now. Of course, you got to start Mateo Uiagalelei, which I expect to take the position of where Jordan Birch was last season. He was 3rd in the Big Ten in sacks last year with 10.5, and I think he is on pace. And I think he will be one of maybe not only the Big Ten, but one of college football's best pass rushers next season. Amari Washington at defensive tackle is the guy. I mentioned Caldwell and I mentioned Harmon. He was that next guy in the defensive tackle rotation. He played all 14 games this season. There wasn't a huge defensive tackle rotation. I certainly think there will be a bigger, more bodies and more people within the defensive line rotation for the Ducks this season. I think Amari Washington has all of the skills to be an all Big Ten player, certainly right now. There's one room that I really like on this team, and it's linebacker. There's a player, like we saw Bryce Betcher take a big step forward last season. I think in the linebacker room, Devin Jackson, who pound for pound might have some of the most speed on this team, I think he's going to take a Bryce Betcher-sized jump this season. Circling back to the defensive line, I think Amari Washington could be that guy that could take a very sizable step forward on this defensive front for the Oregon Ducks. And then you look at somebody like a Blake Purchase, who's dealt with some injuries, but he's had some good production while at Oregon. Elijah Rushing and Aiden Breland are both 5-stars that are itching to get their opportunity on this Ducks defensive line, and man, they are great. Notice one name that I haven't even mentioned yet, and it's a former USC Trojan, Bear Alexander. I think with what Oregon has been able to recruit, what Oregon has been able to populate within this defensive line room with what I just talked about, I didn't even mention somebody like a Tatum Tuioti, who's kind of that jack outside linebacker that can certainly line up on the edge of the defensive line opposite of Mateo Uiagalelei. And having Tatum and Mateo on either side, you double team Mateo, Tatum's going to be able to get a favorable matchup, certainly coming off of the edge as well. But I didn't even mention Bear Alexander. I think with the depth within this room and with what I've already talked about, he is the definition, and he was the definition of this when he came into this program, but he is the definition of low risk and high reward. If Bear Alexander doesn't work out, and it's a lot like what we saw at USC, it's completely fine. But what if Tony Tuioti, the defensive line coach at Oregon, Tosh Lupoi, the defensive coordinator. What if this defensive coaching staff gets something out of Bear Alexander, gets him on the right track, maybe what Georgia and USC wasn't able to do? Now I think that's where this Oregon defensive line steps up into some of the better defensive lines in college football. When you have a Bear, an Amari, a Mateo on that first front, and then you can rotate in the Blake Purchases, the Aiden Brelands, the Elijah Rushings of the world. Now, depth on the defensive line. Ask Michigan how important depth on the defensive line is to being a championship-level football team. I love that defensive line group, certainly, for the Oregon Ducks. I think the interior offensive line is also going to take center stage. I think the interior offensive line has a pretty darn good chance to be better than the interior offensive line of last season. Big part of it is because of a USC transfer in Emmanuel Pranon, one of the best interior offensive linemen in this transfer portal cycle. You combine him with Iapani Lalaolu at center, also known as Pancho. I think he's going to step up and be, he already did last year, but I think he's going to take more steps forward as being one of the best centers in the Big Ten, if not all of college football. Whether it's Dave Iuli, whether it's Matthew Bedford at the other guard position, I think the interior of this offensive line is now going to be the strengths of this group. I know a lot of people have said a lot of good things about Isaiah World, who's transferring in from Nevada. Of course, Alex Harkey is another tackle transfer certainly out there, but with transfers coming from the group of five up to the Power 2 level, there's always a little bit certainly of uncertainty. I feel more certain about the interior of the offensive line that they're going to be able to move some people. And I think the run game is going to benefit. I mentioned how Dante Moore is going to be able to sling the ball a little bit more down the field. And there's been some people, like Tez Johnson said it at the Rose Bowl media availability, that said, hey, Dante Moore might be a Heisman finalist next season. I get that, and hey, I might agree with it. But here's my spicy take. You want to hear a hot take? I'm not a big hot take guy, but you want to hear a spicy take? Let me hit you with it. Yeah, everybody, you can throw out your Dante Moore, Heisman contender, and Heisman predictions. Okay, that's cool. I'll hit you with Mekhi Hughes. The running back coming in from Tulane that's had back-to-back over 1,300 yards at Tulane. Now that he's on a bigger stage, now that he's running behind a better offensive line, I think there's the potential for him to be one of the best running backs in all of college football next season. There's a chance you might see Mekhi Hughes on the stage in New York. Maybe you'll see both Mekhi Hughes and Dante Moore on the stage in New York City. But I think that this is going to be an ultra-balanced offense for the Oregon Ducks, certainly next season. All right, let's start to answer the question. The Ducks 2025 versus the Ducks 2024. And I'm going to kind of continue with where I just left off. I think that this is going to be one of the more balanced offenses in college football, and I certainly think that's going to help out a first-year starter in Dante Moore to be able to lean on a really good run game with Mekhi Hughes and Noah Whittington certainly in there as well. But because of the arm talent, of the ability of Dante Moore and the speed that they have, and I didn't even mention who I think will be one of the best tight ends in the Big Ten in Kenyon Sadiq, I think this offense will be a better, more explosive, higher productive offense in 2025 than it was in 2024. Okay? So we've established that. Second part, defense. I think defense is a big pivot point. I talked about linebackers. I really like their linebacker room. Starting off, we'll see what happens with depth, but Betcher and Tuioti and Devin Jackson, I feel really good about those pieces. I talked about the defensive line, how I think that can be a deep group. I think the secondary is going to be a huge pivot point as to whether this defense is going to be better. And for Oregon, continue to raise and climb up the ladder. The secondary and the defense overall needs to be better, especially against the better teams in the conference of college football. The defense gave up over 1,000 yards, 1,030 to be exact, in the last two games of the season, Big Ten championship game against Penn State, and of course the Rose Bowl against Ohio State. A lot of that dials into the secondary. Is this talent going to be able to step up and be better in the secondary? If it is, I think overall this Oregon team could be better in 2025 than it was in 2024. And folks, that is certainly saying something.